I've spent much of my life searching for the stories of the African American people.
Our first notation of Anthony Johnson essentially defines him as Antonio the Negro.
I've always wanted to tell their history. 5 centuries in the making. It's a living history. And I've traveled around the country and across the globe to chronicle it.
Assalamu alaikum. Did any of you receive wealth inherited from the slave trade?
Black people changed American society.
America probably wouldn't have much of a popular culture without black people.
We blackified it. We took everything and made it better.
You're a good cook, man.
Black people redefined the American dream.
Robert Smalls epitomizes America. Come from nothing and to be a success.
They held the country to its ideals, even when it abandoned them. In these 6 hours, I'll tell the stories of some of the people, places, and events that made Black history. Stories of courage, determination, and the power of hope.
Are you prepared to take the oath, Senator?
I am.
Funding for the African Americans, Many Rivers to Cross was made possible by
Senegal, Africa, the door of no return. From these shores, millions of Africans went across oceans and continents, battlefields, racial barriers, and constitutional divides. Bank of America is proud to sponsor Many Rivers to Cross, an epic journey through 500 years of African American history. We believe connecting to our past helps us all create a better future.
Yeah, they have it. Wi-Fi, settings.
May I, Mr. Jones?
Please.
Some connections are generational.
Thanks.
Others, just a few minutes. Either way, our signal is strong and deeply rooted in the community. The simple joy of staying in touch.
The Howard and Abby Milstein Foundation, in partnership with Hoover Milstein and Emigrant Bank.
African American history is an epic story, our American story. We're proud to fund this important program. Please join us in supporting your public television station.
The Coca-Cola Company. The Ford Foundation Just Films. Dr. Georgette Bennett and Dr. Leonard Polonsky, in memory of Rabbi Mark H. Tannenbaum. Richard Gilder. The Hutchins Family Foundation, and by the following: the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by viewers like you. Thank you.
The African American story begins here on the Atlantic Ocean. Africans crossed these waters with the very first European explorers. And their stories show that right from the start, the black people who came to this land nurtured aspirations and dreams. Dreams that would never disappear, even in the long night of slavery. Dreams that would help them endure and overcome. Florida. The first known African in America came here with Spanish explorers in 1513. His name was Juan Garrido. He was free and he left his mark on the New World. Garrido helped Cortez take Mexico. Then he headed for California, searching for gold. "20 years later, a black man struggled to cross this Texas desert. He was called Esteban the Moor. He was one of just 4 survivors of a Spanish expedition that went horribly wrong. Esteban served as a guide and a translator for his companions, negotiating their way to safety across this forbidding landscape. By the year 1536, they had walked 15,000 miles. They had seen more of the North American continent than any explorers would until Lewis and Clark. Garrido and Esteban were among the first Africans in our country. They found hope and opportunity here. But things changed quickly. Jamestown, Virginia, the first British colony in what became the United States.
In 1619, this was the ultimate frontier town. Crude fortifications bordering a muddy, malarial swamp. Then one morning in August, a ship appeared, the White Lion.
It was a pirate ship carrying African slaves. Roughly 20 of them were traded here for food. That's how slavery began in the English colonies. Plantations, as we imagine them, didn't exist yet. This was just a fragile outpost in the wilderness.
Lives in colonial Virginia were very precarious. They were really stuck at the edge of survival. Whoever was trying.
I've come here, just a few miles from Jamestown, to look for traces of a man named Anthony Johnson. A man whose life shows how slavery evolved in Virginia.
Our first notation of Anthony Johnson is from an early Virginia muster roll, which essentially defines him as Antonio the Negro.
So his blackness was part of his name, his title.
Exactly.
Despite his skin color, Johnson found opportunities in Jamestown. He worked side by side with his owner and forged a bond based on necessity.
In order for the master to survive, he needed Anthony Johnson to make a farm in this kind of environment. It was all about manual labor. So Anthony Johnson earned his way to his own freedom. And his master actually provided him with sort of a startup, if you will.
You even gave him a little cash, some land?
Some land, it seems, yes.
Anthony Johnson soon began to prosper. He owned a 250-acre tobacco farm, he had white indentured servants, and he even had an African slave of his own. But as Johnson prospered, so did Virginia. Within decades, Jamestown had become the center of a booming tobacco economy that was desperate for labor. And this transformed slavery from a loose, informal arrangement into a rigid racial system. A system in which a life like Anthony Johnson's would be inconceivable.
Johnson's blackness, his Africanness, these things define him, mark him as an outsider.
The stigma of blackness.
The stigma of blackness. And the fact that the status was tied to that observable trait was one which is very difficult to surmount.
After Johnson died, a court ruled that he was, quote, a Negro, and by consequence, an alien. And then the colony of Virginia seized his family's land. Johnson's story marked a new era in the British colonies. From this point on, slavery would be solely based on race. And the acquisition of slaves would be central to the acquisition of wealth. In effect, the British were simply trying to do what many Europeans had already done. By the time Anthony Johnson arrived in Jamestown in the early 1620s, more than 500,000 enslaved Africans had already been spread across the New World, into Brazil, Mexico, and the Caribbean. The free labor of these slaves was making fortunes for the Portuguese and the Spanish. Now, the British wanted to get in on the action.
Most of the largest cities of the Americas were dominated by Africans. There were more Africans in those cities than there were Europeans. Here I'm talking about places like Mexico City, Lima, Panama City, Havana. So when Jamestown is founded, all of those colonists understood a world in which Africans were the primary labor force for producing wealth for Europe.
I think it's important to understand the British are not innovating when they settle Jamestown. They're trying to catch up. American historians sometimes treat the emergence of slavery as a mystery, right? We often people look at, how did all these Africans get here? The real mystery would have been if slavery had not developed in Virginia.
A brutal equation ruled the New World. Black equaled slave. And to fulfill their hunger for slaves, the British turned to the place that many other Europeans had turned already, Africa. Sierra Leone was once a major hub for the slave trade. More than 300,000 people were taken from here and shipped to the New World in bondage. But the first slave traders in this place weren't Europeans. They were other black Africans. Africans practiced slavery long before they ever saw a white person. All across this continent, slaves were part of a system based not on race, but on ethnic difference and brute power. A system involving an enormous array of monarchs, merchants, and mercenaries.
African kingdoms were at war with one another. War was a theme in Africa and actually Europe as well for many, many years. And so as a part of these wars, as a result of these wars, people were taken hostage and made into slaves.
I've come to Port Loko, a river town in Sierra Leone, and the long-standing home of the Temne people. For centuries, the Temne here collected captives who had been taken in wars. They tied them, packed them into small boats, and sailed them downstream, where they were sold to Europeans for profit. We sometimes romanticize Africa. We think that Africa was idyllic until the white man came. But there were deep tensions between ethnic groups here. Black Africans didn't necessarily feel the bonds of skin color any more strongly than, say, white Europeans did.
Slavery was ongoing before the Europeans came. It was just a common business. They come here in this wharf. Here is the landing part for the boats.
Who were the slave traders?
The slave traders were great warriors, strong men, chiefs. They do this business.
A lot of misery loaded on these boats.
Yes, but our people, we are not thinking about misery. It was a lucrative business.
Mm-hmm. Assalamu alaikum. Professor Gates. I was surprised to find out that in Port Loko today, there are still many families whose ancestors profited from the trade. And some of them were willing to tell me about it. Good. Just speak from your heart. Did any of you receive wealth inherited from the slave trade?
More fear, not an 500 slaves.
500?
500.
My God, so he was very rich.
Yes, yes, our people we are rich. Until the road account of Karam then people saw come ban or ante Kotego and Apagua are Rome Bomiowi.
Would chiefs wage war just to get slaves?
Oh, yes.
I'm a pinkar, my beer, my bang, ambayang.
In America, we think black men were selling black people to the white man. But when you see it, do you see it as Temne were buying Loko, Mende were buying Temne?
etc. Is there a difference?
Well,
were all black people black?
Only BB.
It's true that black people are black.
So for certain team,
we don't speak the same language.
I
don't like what you like.
Mas for certain skin is a pueblo man.
You know, we don't just live in harmony.
Though some find it difficult to face, the crucial role of Africans in the slave trade is now well documented. Historians estimate that the overwhelming majority of the slaves shipped to the New World were captured and sold by African kingdoms. But Africans did not invent slavery. It existed everywhere, dating back to the most ancient civilizations. Nor did Africans envision slavery as something that would be passed on from one generation to the next, something based exclusively on race. That was a European innovation.
Europeans had actually developed an idea over several centuries that they should not enslave each other. They could kill each other, torture each other, fight each other in wars. But Europeans did not enslave other Europeans because Christians did not enslave other Christians. The great advantage of Africans is that they were outside the European community. And so it was possible to use race as a way of providing a marker of who's enslavable and who's not.
Sailing in ships of radical new design, armed with new weapons and new technologies, Europeans transformed slavery into a business far larger and far crueler than anything the Africans had ever done. Of course, it didn't happen overnight. The dehumanization of an entire race was a process requiring many steps. One occurred here. This beautiful island, shrouded in fog, is home to what was once a fortress built by the British in the 1670s.
Out there is the mouth of the Putloko Creek. African middlemen used to bring their slaves and goods down the Putloko Creek, through the mouth of the Putloko Creek out there, all the way to this beach here.
So they came right through that gap,
Yes,
right
sir.
there.
Yes.
They would bring them here, then march them straight up there and sell them.
Up this hill, up onto the trading area.
Though its walls have long crumbled, I could still get a sense of how this place once worked.
This was the main entrance into the fort. It had a double folding door with a little room patch on top.
British officers lived here in a lavish two-story mansion.
That's a fireplace, a fake fireplace, because there is no flue. This is the tropics. You don't need a fire in the tropics. But it was an attempt by the slave traders that lived here at elegance.
A little touch of home.
A little touch of home.
How many men?
The British enjoyed parties here, even a small golf course. Slaves, meanwhile, were herded like cattle.
In here is the women's and children's slave yard.
They were branded, then held in pens for shipment to the New World.
So the men were over there and the women and children were right here.
So they could hear each other's cries?
Definitely. They could have heard each other's cries, but they could not help each other. In fact, let me show you the men's slave yard. It's right through these doors. By the time they got here, we were very terrified. And then they were examined like cattle, their eyes, teeth. And then when the slaves were taken out to be put on board the slave ships, they were branded with the letter S on their left breast to denote that they came from Sierra Leone.
This place was not unusual. There were dozens of forts like this, up and down the African coast. We're not even sure exactly how many slaves passed through this island. 50,000 at least. We know the names of a handful and the stories of a precious few. In 1756, a British ship named the Hare set sail for Charleston carrying 80 African slaves. One of them was a 10-year-old girl. We don't know where she was from. We don't know her parents' names. But we do know the name that her master gave her, Priscilla.
in the water, in the water, children, in the water.
Priscilla was at the start of a journey that would change her life forever. The dreaded Middle Passage.
The entire experience is so horrific and so just brutalizing in ways that are just unimaginable for a contemporary audience. You have public floggings, you have decapitation, being immersed in your own bodily excrement. It is complete loss of control over your life in every way possible. Think about an 8, a 9, a 10-year-old. It is something that you're never going to forget, and it's going to be etched in your memory.
Women on the ship, even girls as young as Priscilla, faced an added danger. They were completely at the mercy of the male crew.
Women were considered to be available prey at any given moment for the entire ship crew throughout the passage. So some women would commit suicide. And some women did decide that I don't want to bring a child into this world. So they inserted some sort of piece of wood or nail or something to, cause violence upon their body. And you also find that some women would actually die from these attempts.
Priscilla spent 10 weeks on the ship. She saw 13 of her fellow Africans die along the way, their corpses thrown into the ocean. Death was so common on slave ships that sharks followed in their wake, feasting on the dead bodies. As the ship drew close to shore, the slaves were rubbed with a mixture of gunpowder and oil to make them look healthier, hiding the wounds from their beatings and chains. Then Priscilla stepped into a new world. Charleston, South Carolina. This was once the center of the slave trade in the 13 colonies. Over 40% of all the slaves who entered our country came through this city. In Priscilla's time, South Carolina had more black slaves than white citizens. In fact, it was called Negro country. Slave auctions were held on the streets of Charleston almost every day. Priscilla was bought at one of these auctions by a rice planter named Elias Ball.
We're on the way to the Ball Plantation, which consisted of 1/2 of Cumming Tea Plantation and about 25 African-American slaves.
Edward Ball is the 5th great-grandson of the man who purchased Priscilla. He's brought me to the land where his family ran rice plantations for almost 2 centuries.
Landlord with 1,000 acres.
So this would have been maybe one little road running through it.
Yeah, and the rice fields were off the river. They were right around here.
Ball told me he had spent years wrestling with his family's past. Priscilla is just one of 4,000 people that they owned.
My dad used to talk about the plantations and Elias Ball and all of the prosperity that our family had lived through, but he never talked about the slaves. He said, there are 5 things we don't talk about in the Ball family: religion, sex, death, money, and the Negroes.
Priscilla arrived here in July 1756. She was 10.
She came as an orphan. No parents, no language, no home. This was her introduction to the rest of her life.
Priscilla's new life centered around this house and the white family that owned it. Though a ruin today, the Ball plantation was once thriving, thanks to the labor of its slaves.
The second Elias, who bought Priscilla, brought 6 children, none of them older than 10. He liked buying children. In fact, he wrote a little memoir in which he said, "Do 2 things with your money, buy land and buy young slaves."
Why?
Better long-term investment. The white folks lived here. The black folks lived about a quarter mile away. The rice fields were about half a mile down that road, and that's where all the work of producing the money took place.
Rice. That's why Priscilla was here. Rice fields like these were making a fortune for slave owners. Don't let their beauty fool you. These places were death traps. The swamp ground was covered with snakes. The tropical air was filled with malarial mosquitoes. A third of South Carolina's slaves died within a year of their arrival, and nearly 2/3 of all children were dead before they turned 16. But Priscilla beat the odds. She and her family survived.
The Balls were fanatical about keeping records. They had books that listed the birthdays of all the slave children, books that listed the deaths of all the slave adults. And all of this stuff is collected in an archive of about 10,000 pages.
My God. Edward Ball spent 3 years poring over his family's records here in the South Carolina Historical Society.
Hampshire, Gambia, ditto, ditto, ditto. All of these men and women from Gambia. London.
Ball was trying to piece together the stories of his family's slaves. For most, he found no story at all. They survived only as names on a page.
Christmas.
People consumed by the brutality of slavery.
Samson. There was an ordinance where if you ran away and you were caught, you had to have 2 toes amputated. If you ran away again and you were caught, you had to have your ears amputated. And if you ran away a 3rd time, the punishment was castration.
Oh, man.
Law of the land.
They were not joking.
They were not kidding around, yeah.
As Ball scanned page after page, he began to see one name repeated.
Priscilla's 10 years old when she comes to Cumming Tea Plantation, and 10 years later, she's having her own children. Monimia, Priscilla's daughter, was born, and Monimia becomes the matriarch, and her grandchildren have children.
Ball was able to trace Priscilla's family tree down generations, stretching from the 1750s all the way to today. For an African American, this is extraordinarily rare.
Now, how are you related to Priscilla?
She is my great-great-great-great-great-grandmother.
Through your mother's
Through
line?
my father.
Through
my
father.
father's.
So your father.
This is Tomalyn Polite.
Right.
She and her husband Antoine are carrying on a family line that began in Sierra Leone more than 250 years ago.
I was 19 years old when I first found out. It really hit me like, oh my gosh, you know, this was my 5th grandmother.
My grandmother, yeah. But she had to be tough.
She had to be. She had to be. I got some of that from her.
I was going to
Tomalyn is remarkably lucky. She actually knows the name of her original African ancestor. I don't know anyone else who could do this. For nearly all African Americans, including me, our original ancestors will remain forever anonymous and invisible. This was not an accident.
Removing people from genealogy is very important to making a slave. So if I only call you by your first name and never by a family name, I'm indicating to everybody, right, that you have no family, right? You're just Jimmy. You're just Sam, you're just Sarah, right? So they'll occupy a station that everybody will publicly recognize is at the lowest rung of society.
Masters worked methodically to erase the identities of their slaves so that they would be more productive. And these tactics were quite effective. Slaves built this country. They built roads and bridges, factories and farms, towns and cities. But they built something else as well, something all their own, a culture.
As much as slave masters tried to control the worlds of their slaves, they were vastly unsuccessful. There was a persistence in history and culture and names that went across the Atlantic despite the best efforts of Europeans.
We tend to assume that the slave is a cipher, right? Because that's ideology. That's the ideology of slavery. That the slave is simply an extension of the master's will. That's the plan. That's the idea. But that's not really what you can ever do to a human being. Human beings always find a way to assert their own prerogatives. So black people create new kinds of cultural patterns that didn't obtain in Africa, that weren't those of the whites, but were something new in the Americas.
This garden signifies crops that enslaved African Americans would have grown, would have been...
One of the most enduring expressions of any culture is food. Even today, we can try to access the world of our ancestors by tasting it.
What do we have here, Michael?
Well, you have a late 18th, early 19th century feast without the okra, just for you.
Michael Twitty is a food historian.
We have calau congri, which are basically black-eyed pea fritters from New Orleans. And then a lot of people in this region had 3 salt herrings a week.
He's cooked me an 18th century meal to show how slaves from different parts of Africa crafted a distinct African American cuisine.
So you get a taste. Hominy or mush, ash cakes, hoe cakes, etc. Would have been the staple of your diet.
Give me some Hoppin' John.
Oh, you gotta have that.
You're a good cook, man.
Thank you, sir. This came out of my garden yesterday afternoon.
Wow.
From Spartanburg, South Carolina. But all those recipes, there's straight out of the history books.
People are great.
When in the history of humankind has an enslaved people revolutionized the way the people who enslaved them ate, drank, believed, the way Africans did in the Americas?
That's sorghum?
Yeah.
This is the first time I've ever
Well,
seen
you see, it looks just like corn.
Twitty has traced the roots of foods that connect Africa, the Caribbean, and the Americas in a vast Black Atlantic culture. A culture the slaves even propagated among their white masters.
It amazed me. One reference was one of the former governors of Virginia, his wife, said that no one bakes a ham better than a big fat Negro mammy.
Oh, really?
And you think about this. The ham as a food was not invented in Africa.
No.
But somehow we got our hands on the sugar cane.
And our ancestors blackified it.
We blackified it. We took everything and made it made it better and made it more soulful, if you will.
So let's put a little pineapple cherries on there and put a little maple syrup.
And brown sugar. Now you know maple syrup. We don't do maple syrup.
Excuse me, brown sugar.
Brown sugar. It's a creolization process. So while the okra soup and the black-eyed peas and the Hoppin' John and the red rice and jambalaya and gumbo, blah, 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 is going to the master's house, those cooks are bringing European Western dishes into the slave quarter.
The flow's going both ways.
The flow is going both ways, and what we have to recognize is everybody puts their stamp on it.
Food was not the only thing flowing throughout the Atlantic world. So were ideas. Ideas about music, dance, religion, but especially ideas about freedom, even if the masters wished otherwise.
Black people knew they were people. Whether whites thought it or not, they knew they were people. And so if you hear words about liberty and freedom, things that they wanted, of course they would think it would apply to them.
St. Augustine, Florida. This is the oldest city in the United States. Built by the Spanish in the 1560s and held by Spain almost continuously until 1821. This beautiful place has special meaning for African Americans. Because as slavery's grip tightened in the British colonies, Spain declared that runaway slaves could come here and be free. Why? Politics. Colonial Spain was locked in a ferocious rivalry with colonial England. So they welcomed any fugitive slaves who would convert to Catholicism, swear loyalty to the Spanish crown, and serve in the colonial militia. Suddenly, slaves in the British colonies simply had to make it across the St. Mary's River into Spanish Florida, and they would be free.
They knew the geopolitics of the region, that the English and the Spaniards were enemies. Enemy of my enemy is my friend, sort of thing. And we often find that they get their information from the Indian groups who have gone back and forth.
So the Indians say, hey, you black people, if you get on the boat, you get down to a place called St. Augustine, you'll be cool, you'll be free.
Well, they wouldn't have known that, but they'd have known where St. Augustine was, and they would have known the Spaniards and the English were at war, that the Spaniards didn't like the English being there, and they took their lives in their hands. They get in a boat and they make it.
Soon there were so many black people in St. Augustine that the Spanish built them their own town, called Fort Mose, just a few miles to the north. Nothing remains of Fort Mose. It is sunk entirely into the swamps of the Atlantic coast. But this was the first all-black settlement in what would become the United States, an outpost of freedom in a slave land.
I'm trying to imagine what it must have felt like to arrive here after traveling through swamps, across rivers, and through the wilderness, finally gaining your freedom at Fort Mose. Slavery breeds dreams of freedom in every human breast. African-American culture is full of references to the day of Jubilee, to making it to the Promised Land. Well, for African slaves, Fort Mose was the Promised Land, and crossing St. Mary's River, well, that was like crossing the River Jordan.
So many slaves tried to run here that the British started executing them in public to staunch the flow. But even that couldn't stop them. "300 miles north of Fort Mose, just outside of Charleston, runs the Stono River. When word of the fort reached this place, it inspired one of the biggest slave revolts in the history of the British colonies. It all started right here, the site of what was once a general store called Hutchinson's.
Sunday morning, September 9th, 1739, Hutchinson's store had been looted. Its guns and ammunition had been stolen. 2 shopkeepers lay dead, their severed heads lying on the steps of the store. Plantations on either side of the river were burning. An army was on the move, an African army.
They were headed for Fort Mose. They set out before dawn, a group of roughly 20 men. Their tactics were simple. They surrounded plantations, then burned them to the ground. The ringleaders came from the Kingdom of Congo, a powerful African state. Some had military training, and they had a plan.
The slaves marched over to Pon Road, which was a road that, if you took it south, it would take you down into Georgia, down into Savannah, and ultimately all the way down to Florida. They were beating drums. Now, the beating of the drums is terribly important because that shows us that they were attempting to draw other Africans into their midst.
By afternoon, the rebel army had grown to nearly 100, and they kept moving south along what today is this highway, which still leads from South Carolina to Florida. But they didn't make it. Just 20 miles outside of Charleston, an armed militia caught up with them in a clearing in these woods. The survivors faced a gruesome fate.
A number of the people who were captured, they'd be beheaded.
Beheaded?
They would be beheaded by the militiamen, and as was a usual practice during the time period, their severed heads were placed on top of posts along the highway.
So right along here,
yeah,
we would have seen the heads,
yes,
of these rebels.
Yes, that's right. And that was meant to instill fear and to teach a lesson to all who observe, to try to discourage people from rebelling.
This must have been the planters' worst nightmare.
It was, absolutely.
I mean, worse than the worst nightmare. They couldn't imagine that these Congo Africans knew anything about guns and ammunition.
That's right. That's right. That's right. Absolutely right. This was the worst insurrection to occur in 18th century British colonial North America.
In the wake of the rebellion, South Carolina imposed harsh new slave laws. They banned drumming and literacy and set drastic punishments on runaways. But no laws ever could force the slaves to accept their fates. Slaves plotted revolts all over the Atlantic world. In Jamaica and Virginia, Barbados and Georgia, even in New York City. Most of them failed. But that didn't stop the slaves from trying. They were always searching for a chance at freedom. And as time passed, freedom seemed to be drawing near. The American Revolution brought immense hope to the slaves. They heard the patriots talk of liberty and equality, and it ignited their own dreams. But for the most part, those dreams were ignored. Even the greatest champion of freedom was hesitant to extend it to black people. This is Mount Vernon, George Washington's estate. For so many of us, an icon of American independence. But for more than 100 African Americans, this was a plantation, where from sunup to sundown, they toiled as slaves. The father of our country was also one of its largest slave owners. Slaves tended his fields and watched over his every need. One worked in these stables, a groomsman named Harry Washington. Harry heard the talk around Mount Vernon about liberty and independence, but he sensed it wasn't meant for slaves. So like many black people, he decided to take his chances with the British.
Once the war comes, there are enslaved men and women saying, hey, we'd love to help you out if you would help us out. We'd be happy to help you suppress this rebellion in Massachusetts if you will grant our freedom in return.
Harry joined a loyalist regiment called the Black Pioneers, and he wasn't the only one. Roughly 20,000 slaves ran away to the British lines, far more than joined the Patriot cause.
There were a lot of Harry Washingtons in the British Army. In fact, it's probably fair to say that especially in the southern colonies, the British Army effort could not have been as successful as it was for a time without the assistance of former slaves.
Unfortunately, most of these black loyalists were ravaged by the war.
Many of them died. Many of them contracted smallpox. They met terrible fates, many of them, but you can understand why they opted for it. That gives you a measure of what slavery was like, that people would take that kind of risk.
Harry Washington was one of the lucky few. In the waning days of the war, the British put him on a ship and evacuated him to Canada.
The British definitely wanted to use the blacks to help them in their struggle against the colonists, but they did not want to, had no intention of actually making them, you know, equal to them and bringing them and making them part of British society. So drop them off there and let them make their way.
Harry didn't stay long in Canada. He and his fellow black loyalists were barred from voting and exploited by local whites. So when the British set up a colony for former slaves back in Sierra Leone, Harry was among the first to emigrate. He ended up near here, one of the very few slaves who ever made it back to Africa. But Harry didn't necessarily want to go back to Africa. You know what Harry wanted? He wanted what his old master George wanted. Freedom. The right to do as he pleased. Unfortunately, he did not find it here. The British government in Sierra Leone tried to limit the property rights of the black settlers. Harry fought back and was banished for insubordination. After that, he disappeared. Harry was a rebel to the end, and it's probably best that he turned his back on America because he wouldn't have liked what America became. The Founding Fathers built a country committed to slavery. The site of Washington, D.C. was chosen as our capital in order to appease Southern slave owners. And why not? They held an enormous amount of power.
None of it exists without slavery. There are no settlements. There is no 13 colonies without slavery. There is no United States without slavery. There's no independence movement without slavery. The whole thing is built upon slavery. That's why they didn't abolish it.
Slavery was a part of American society from the very beginning. When the Declaration of Independence was signed, slavery was legal in each of the 13 colonies. And take this building here, our magnificent Capitol. Slaves quarried and cut its oldest stones. Its innermost bricks were laid by slaves. You see the statue of the Native American on top? The symbol of freedom? One of the people who cast it was a slave. But even if the ideals of the American Revolution were perverted by slavery, the ideals themselves endured. They lingered in the hearts of black people, and they spread throughout the Atlantic world. Saint-Domingue. At the close of the American Revolution, this was a French colony. It was the world's largest producer of coffee and sugar. And it had the largest concentration of slaves in the Western Hemisphere. Almost twice as many Africans were brought here as were brought to the entire United States. In essence, this was the epicenter of slavery in the New World. But in August of 1791, this colony began to collapse as the slaves rose up against their hated masters. Inspired by the same ideals as the American patriots, they fought off European armies and founded a new nation, Haiti, the world's first black republic. Never before in history had slaves overthrown their masters.
The Haitian Revolution becomes this great beacon of hope, right, for what's possible. Another world is possible. Slavery can end.
How in the world would a slave, completely illiterate, stuck on a plantation, hear about the Haitian Revolution?
Well, illiterate doesn't mean ignorant, right? That's the first thing we have to understand, which is that news is traveling all around aboard ships, right? So sailors, they're spreading news about what's going on. And then the slaves hear ideas about freedom and equality and liberty. that are incredibly important to black people. And so they raise hopes to an extremely high level.
Unfortunately, here in the United States, those hopes were dashed. African Americans had to wait almost a century for their freedom. But even so, Haiti had a profound impact. For generation after generation, Haiti was a source of immense pride. A free black nation in a world that thought black people were fit only to be slaves. That pride can still be seen today, if you know where to look. These men are part of a celebration that stretches back almost 2 centuries. A celebration of our living connection to Haiti. They get up before dawn on Mardi Gras morning and parade through New Orleans, waking the city to celebrate with a Haitian Vodun tradition.
Enjoy your life. I can dig that. You never know. You might not wake up tomorrow. That's right. So they make sure that everybody wake up on Mardi Gras Day. So if they don't wake up, they're dead. If they don't wake up, you're dead. Right. That's the message. If you don't wake up, you're dead. So that's their job, to wake everybody up and make sure that you enjoy Mardi Gras.
They've been doing this since 1819, soon after a group of Haitian refugees came to New Orleans via Cuba and started the tradition. It's one of the oldest parts of Mardi Gras, and a living reminder that African American history isn't limited to the story of the United States. It's part of a much wider history, the history of a people scattered like sand throughout the Atlantic world.
The way we think of history is in national terms. So U.S. history is U.S. history, and it's discrete from Jamaican history or Haitian history or British history or French history. And it turns out that national history really emerges in these Atlantic cross currents, right, that involve Africa, the Caribbean, South America, Europe, and North America.
African American culture was born in the mixing of people and ideas from all over the Atlantic world. Mixing made us strong. It gave us hope. It sustained us. Less than a mile from the Mardi Gras parades runs the mighty Mississippi River. In the decades after the Haitian Revolution, this river became the site and symbol of a new phase in American slavery, the violent rise of the Deep South. But the memory of Haiti was never forgotten. It was mixed into the fabric of African American culture. It became an inspiration for countless numbers of black people who dared to dream of their freedom. They would need that inspiration in the harsh and dreadful years to come.
Funding for the African Americans, Many Rivers to Cross was made possible by
Senegal, Africa, the door of no return. From these shores, millions of Africans went across oceans and continents, battlefields, racial barriers, and constitutional divides. Bank of America is proud to sponsor Many Rivers to Cross, an epic journey through 500 years of African American history. We believe connecting to our past helps us all create a better future.
Yeah, they have it. Wi-Fi, settings.
May I, Mr. Jones?
Please. Some connections are generational.
Thanks.
Others, just a few minutes. Either way, our signal is strong and deeply rooted in the community. The simple joy of staying in touch.
The Howard and Abby Milstein Foundation, in partnership with Hoover Milstein and Emigrant Bank.
African American history is an epic story, our American story. We're proud to fund this important program. Please join us in supporting your public television station.
The Coca-Cola Company. The Ford Foundation Just Films. Dr. Georgette Bennett and Dr. Leonard Polonsky, in memory of Rabbi Mark H. Tannenbaum. Richard Gilder, the Hutchins Family Foundation, and by the following: the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by viewers like you. Thank you. Next time on The African Americans, the struggle for freedom continues.
The Underground Railroad makes me want to claim slaves as my ancestors.
Here's the cupboard that Sam hid in.
My God, it's just so tiny.
The African Americans, Many Rivers to Cross. The African American story continues online at pbs.org/manyrivers with streaming video and more.
The American Revolution was an inspiration to black people. They hoped the words of the patriots would apply equally to them, but they were wrong. When the armies left the fields, we were a country of farmers, founded on notions of freedom, and our largest farms were worked by slaves. There were 700,000 slaves in the United States at its birth. They had no rights and no power, yet they were determined to hold America to its ideals. Their struggle would last for generations, and that struggle would fundamentally reshape the character of our nation.
Funding for the African Americans, Many Rivers to Cross was made possible by
Senegal, Africa, the door of no return. From these shores, millions of Africans went across oceans and continents, battlefields, racial barriers, and constitutional divides. Bank of America is proud to sponsor Many Rivers to Cross, an epic journey through 500 years of African American history. We believe connecting to our past helps us all create a better future.
Yeah, they have it. Wi-Fi, settings.
May I, Mr. Jones?
Please.
Some connections are generational.
Thanks.
Others, just a few minutes. Either way, our signal is strong and deeply rooted in the community. The simple joy of staying in touch.
The Howard and Abby Milstein Foundation, in partnership with Hoover Milstein and Emigrant Bank.
African American history is an epic story, our American story. We're proud to fund this important program. Please join us in supporting your public television station.
The Coca-Cola Company. The Ford Foundation Just Films. Dr. Georgette Bennett and Dr. Leonard Polonsky, in memory of Rabbi Mark H. Tannenbaum. Richard Gilder. The Hutchins Family Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by viewers like you. Thank you.
Sheffield, Massachusetts. At the time of the American Revolution, this was slave country. Slavery was legal here, just as it was in each of the 13 colonies. But the Revolution brought new laws to this land. And here, in this farmhouse, one slave began to test those laws. Her name was Mumbet. For decades, she served meals in these rooms. Then she heard talk around the table of a new constitution that said all men were free. So Mumbet decided to act. She ran away to the nearby town of Stockbridge, where she convinced a young lawyer to help her file a suit. Other slaves had sued their masters before, but this case was different. Mumbet was challenging the very existence of slavery in Massachusetts. Her argument was that slavery violated the most basic principle of the American Revolution, that all human beings were created equal. It was a powerful argument, and she won. Mambet's victory echoed across the young nation. Within 2 decades, every state in the North was on the road to abolition. And this political transformation was accompanied by a religious one, as an evangelical revival spread across the country, proclaiming that all races were equal in the eyes of God.
You have these big outdoor preaching sessions where people gather in large numbers to hear a charismatic preacher give the word of God.
Didn't our Lord deliver Daniel?
A lot of it is the language of Exodus, which is something that's very dangerous for a slave society, because when people begin to read the story of Exodus and think about the delivery of God's chosen people from bondage in Egypt, they begin to think about their own delivery. And they begin to interpret that as God's mandate for them to become abolitionists. And so that becomes very important in a white awakening to the evil of slavery.
The evangelical movement also offered opportunities to black people. Among them, a young slave named Richard Allen. Allen grew up on a Delaware farm much like this. In the woods nearby, he heard traveling preachers say that slavery was a mortal sin. And Allen hatched a plan to make his master listen.
His master was religious, but not in any kind of intensive way. Richard Allen really tried to cultivate that.
It sounds like Richard Allen was a bit of a trickster.
Allen was a quietly intensive man who's always plotting to gain his freedom. So once he gets his master's trust, he convinces these anti-slavery preachers to visit his master's house. And when they do that, he knows what they're going to say. They're going to convince Allen's master that he is sinning and is going to go to hell unless he emancipates.
Allen put the kajunga on him, man.
Well, as he puts it in his autobiography, soon after the preachers visited his house, my master allowed us to buy our freedom. So he knew what he was doing every step of the way.
Now free, Richard Allen set out to share his faith with the world. He soon became a preacher himself, spreading the message of equality. And in the winter of 1786, he arrived here in Philadelphia. At the time, Philadelphia was the largest city in the United States and home to a burgeoning abolitionist movement that opposed slavery on religious grounds. It was also a magnet for a steadily growing population of free black people.
Philadelphia, it's the Harlem of early America. This is where people go to make their way in culture, to find new job opportunities, to bond in a social way.
Allen was invited to preach in a white church that was caught up in the spirit of the time. It must have seemed like he'd reached the promised land. But Allen soon faced a hard fact. Freedom was one thing. Equality was something else.
Race rears its ugly head. White preachers there separate black Congregationalists. By the 1790s, there's going to be a black pew, which is separate and above the white pew. And Richard Allen thinks that this violates everything he learned.
Emboldened, Allen made a decision that would change history. He and his friends decided to stage America's first sit-in.
They're going to march into the church. They're not going to sit in the Negro pews. They're going to go down into the front of the church and they're going to sit with other congregants. So Richard Allen's praying, his great friend Absalom Jones is praying next to him. White preachers come up, tap them on the shoulder and say, "You got to get out of here." And after prayers are over, Richard Allen, together with all the other black congregants, get up, march out of the church in a body, and as he says, we never returned.
Allen resolved to start his own church, an African-American church, the first of its kind in the United States. His efforts began humbly. He bought a blacksmith shop, dragged it onto a vacant lot, and set up a temporary parish. Then he spent the next 23 years struggling to make it permanent. Allen's church, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, still thrives today. This is just one of its 7,000 congregations around the globe.
Gotta tell you, you all look wonderful down here. To a person from the early 19th century, Richard Allen would have been like what President Barack Obama is to us today. He did what nobody thought was possible.
And he showed that black people could create and sustain their own institution.
Oh, absolutely. If you look at the modern civil rights movement, that really the blueprint was laid here.
It started here, indeed.
I mean, for example, Rosa Parks, here she is an AME member, a stewardess in an AME church in Alabama. And I am convinced that having heard the story of Allen's walkout all of her life, that as she sat on that bus, deep down, she knew that she was not, you know, stepping out into uncharted territory.
Allen's church was a powerful rebuke to the very existence of slavery. If black people could build a place like this, what couldn't they do? For one hopeful moment at the end of the 18th century, that question hung over the entire nation, North and South. Some Southerners began to free their slaves. Small, free black communities began to spring up in southern cities. And it briefly seemed as if America might actually live up to the promise of its revolution. But the moment didn't last. The agrarian South was simply too dependent upon slave labor. Southern lawmakers began to erect enormous obstacles in front of masters who wanted to free their slaves. It was a crushing blow to the African Americans still held in bondage, but some refused to accept it. On Sunday, August 10th, 1800, a group of slaves gathered near this creek on the outskirts of Richmond, Virginia. Sunday was their day off, but this Sunday, they'd come to plot a revolt, summoned by a young blacksmith named Gabriel.
Here's a guy who, if he lived in Bumbetz, Massachusetts, things would be different. He's got a skill, he's literate, he's respected, but he's tied to the plantation.
Gabriel recruited followers from miles around, armed them with homemade swords, then organized them for battle. His plans called for 3 separate slave armies to seize the Virginia capital and kidnap its governor. Slavery was to be ended by negotiation, but it never happened. On the day of the uprising, a violent storm hit Richmond. Trees fell, bridges were washed away. Gabriel decided to postpone. But when the storm broke, 2 slaves panicked and told their masters. The rebels were rounded up, tried, and sentenced to death.
In the end, in your judgment, was Gabriel a patriot?
He believed in what the Founding Fathers claimed were American ideals, that he believed in freedom for all people. He didn't want to kill people for the sake of killing people. He wanted to kill a handful of people to free several 100,000 enslaved Virginians. And that, I think, makes him a patriot.
Slave-holding Virginia took a different view of Gabriel. He and his fellow rebels were marched down this path to a gallows. Then they were executed and buried in unmarked graves beneath this field. In a sense, their deaths marked the end of one era and the start of another.
Cotton is king. In 1781, a New England farm boy named Eli Whitney put together a few boards and rollers.
Many of us learned this story as children. Eli Whitney, a Yankee tinkerer, invented a machine that launched the Industrial Revolution. What we didn't learn was that Whitney's cotton gin also launched a new phase of American slavery, a phase in which ideas about black freedom were overwhelmed by the need for black labor. It would be the nadir of African American history. And it all started with a simple white plant.
It was economically unfeasible to grow cotton before the cotton gin, because it took one individual about 10 hours to produce 1 pound of usable cotton.
One individual, 10 hours, 1 pound.
Right.
Of clean cotton.
Right, clean cotton. And so even the first primitive gin could produce about 50 pounds of cotton in one day. And very quickly they grow until eventually they're producing thousands of pounds of cotton a day.
And this is the greatest economic boom in the history of the United States.
Oh, sure. The whole country's benefited from this, yeah.
What made cotton so desirable? A perfect storm. In the 1790s, America's oldest crops, like tobacco, were depleting farmland and dropping in value. At the same time, the textile industry in Great Britain was exploding, creating enormous international demand for cotton clothing. Eli Whitney's gin merely provided the motor for a global economic machine, and slavery was its fuel.
Everybody was getting a piece of it. All these northern bankers and marketing people, folks who owned the ships that transported the cotton, everybody was getting a piece of the pie.
Cotton utterly transformed the United States, making fertile land from Georgia to Texas extraordinarily valuable. The fact that Native Americans lived on these lands was a temporary inconvenience, solved by a policy of Indian removal. The massive replacement of native populations with slave plantations. It's a part of our troubled history that can still be seen from the air.
If we were flying over this prior to European settlement, we would have seen large fields of corn and beans, trees and squash. When the first English began moving in here, they began chopping down the trees and expanding the fields available for cotton.
The enormous profitability of cotton undermined the principles of the American Revolution and forever altered black life. The more money the planters made from growing cotton, the more cotton the planters wanted to grow, and that took more slaves. Slaves in the Upper South became incredibly more valuable as commodities because of this demand for them in the Deep South. They were sold off in droves, and that created a second Middle Passage. And in many ways, the second Middle Passage was just as devastating as the first. To feed King Cotton, more than 1 million African Americans were carried off into the Deep South. That's 2.5 times the number that were brought to the United States from Africa. It was the largest forced migration in American history. And it filled the countryside with a haunting sight. slaves chained together, marching south.
You'd hear the clanking of the chains as the enslaved people walk through here.
Like a prison gang.
Exactly, exactly. The men usually were in front, and they were always chained by the necks and by the wrists. Women weren't always chained, but sometimes they were. I always tell people to think about the 5 senses when you talk about slavery. So what do you hear, what do you think, what do you taste, what do you smell? You'll hear weeping and sobbing and wailing. And oftentimes when families were separated, you'll have enslaved narratives talk about how they heard their mothers screaming up until the distance, until the wagon was gone, you know, or even when the wagon was gone, they could still hear the screams from the mothers.
Do you have nightmares about it? Do you dream about it?
Yes, yes. It's the stories about women and being raped. Here they are walking 200-300 miles journey, tired. Then at night they were being raped. I can't imagine the kind of shame that enslaved people felt. And if there was a partner around, to have to witness that, somebody putting their hands on their partner like that must have been really difficult.
It must have been a nightmare.
Yeah.
The Second Middle Passage lasted roughly 70 years, from 1790 right up to the Civil War. For black people in the South, that meant 70 years of near constant upheaval. Slave families that had been stable for generations were suddenly and irrevocably shattered.
Every time somebody was sold, people would come out of the fields to say goodbye to the people who were leaving. And they had certain hymns that they would sing about seeing each other again in heaven. And so that music and paying homage to those people was really a way of saying they did have bonds, and that when those were being broken, they had to have some kind of way of saying goodbye.
Look down, look down, that long, lonesome road, where you and I must go.
The rise of cotton affected every African American, even those who were free. This was especially true for the free black people who remained in the South, struggling to build lives within a slave economy. Some made decisions that are difficult for us to understand today. This cemetery holds the remains of the Brown Fellowship Society, an elite organization of free black men in Charleston, South Carolina.
They came together to promote their common goals, their common purposes, mutual elevation, social advancement. But
the Society's members were craftsmen and tradesmen. Many of their clients were white slave owners, and some chose to buy slaves for themselves. But their motives were complex.
We can't shy away from the fact that you had free blacks that owned slaves and used them in the same way that whites did. But we also know that you had people who were free who were, quote unquote, married to a slave spouse. And what they might do is purchase the enslaved spouse, but now the law would not allow them to emancipate the person. And so they end up holding the individual who was really their husband or wife as a slave.
Why didn't they challenge the status quo?
They didn't challenge the status quo because they understood how precarious their freedom was.
Try to imagine having to purchase your own spouse. That was the reality for some free black people in the South. They existed on the margins of the largest slave society in the history of the world. The white planters who stood above them were making more money than any other group in America. They set the political course of our nation by controlling its wealth, crafting a new landscape with new centers of power. Like Natchez, Mississippi. In 1800, this was a trading post. 50 years later, there were more millionaires here per capita than anywhere else in America. And in their day, money flowed from a place just nearby. This is called Forks of the Road. It's the dividing point on a rural highway right outside Natchez. It may look like a sleepy intersection, but this was once the second largest slave market in the United States. A place where black people from the Upper South were brought to be sold into the Deep South.
This was a specialty market. You know, you go to certain places and you know where you can get what you want. That was this place. If you wanted a field hand, you can find them here. If you wanted somebody with more technical skills, you can find them here. Builders, carpenters, any and everything you were looking for.
This is like a shopping center.
What it was like going to Costco or Walmart, but the product that was being sold
were human beings. Tens of thousands of slaves were sold at Forks of the Road. And the planters who bought them weren't just buying workers for their cotton fields. They had a very specific interest in women.
You wanted men for the heavy labor, and you particularly may have had an interest in females for their ability to reproduce the next generation of enslaved people for your particular plantation.
The high cost of purchasing even a single slave meant that most masters tried to breed their own labor force. And some went to great lengths to make it happen, from forced pairings of slave couples to rape. Of all the major slave societies in the New World, only in the United States did the slave population naturally increase over time. The 400,000 people that we imported from Africa had become nearly 4 million by the outbreak of the Civil War. The numbers are staggering, and so was the violence required to keep them all under control. This small museum in Walterboro, South Carolina, holds evidence of that violence. Objects that seem to come from the Middle Ages.
Oh man, look at that.
Yeah, for the neck.
No whip.
They would pour salt in the wounds of people after they'd been whipped.
Yeah.
Men, women, children whipped.
Slave muzzle.
What had that person said? Why was that person being muzzled? You know, what always strikes me when I look at items like this, probably some enslaved blacksmith created these items.
You had to make the instruments for your own oppression.
Exactly.
What choices did you have?
The shackles.
You have all of these implements of torture, which are tools for punishing people, right, who don't do what they're supposed to do. But they're also symbolic, right? So if you see someone muzzled or whipped in your community, you're warned what not to do. It creates this pervasive sense of fear and terror. Slavery doesn't have to mean that you're whipped every day, you're raped every day, that you're tortured every day, to be incredibly destructive to one's spirit and soul and being. You just have to commit such shocking violence upon the bodies of a few examples that nobody else would dare to think about it. Now, the funny thing is, people still do dare, right? Right? You still do have people saying, like, well, you know, whatever they got, it's got to be better than this.
Early on the morning of August 22nd, 1831, a group of slaves crept into the plantation house that once stood on these Virginia fields. They killed the planter and his wife. Then they killed the children. The bloodiest slave revolt in American history was underway. Over the next 2 days, more than 60 white people would die.
They go house to house, and as they go, they pretty much kill every man, woman, and child that they can find. It was incredibly personal. These are the people that these rebels were killing were often people whom they'd grown up with, whose parents had enslaved their parents.
The slaves were led by a man named Nat Turner, a self-styled prophet who claimed that God had told him to slay his enemies. In hindsight, his motive seemed much simpler.
Why did he do it? Why him? Why here? Why then?
He did it because slavery was awful. Slavery was horrible. He did it because daily he was watching communities be torn apart. He did it because he knew the stories of women abused by slave owners. He knew the stories of how from farm to farm being split up was horrible. Mm-hmm. And he knew the constant threat of being shipped away.
Turner's revolt was crushed on this field by a local militia. Looking back, it's easy to see it as a suicide mission, the desperate act of a people pushed too far. But it was more than that. Turner made real the secret hopes of millions of slaves, and he sent shockwaves across slaveholding America.
The Nat Turner Revolt happens in an international context where not only are the abolitionists in the North beginning to gear up their agitation against slavery, but also in the British Empire, slavery is on its last legs. In 1838, it's over, and slavery has ended in the British Empire. Southern planters are overwhelmingly concerned with this. They know that if slavery is not defended aggressively, it's going to be over, right? And Nat Turner is just one warning signal among many that they're on the losing side of a global battle.
In the wake of Turner's revolt, Southern planters defended themselves by launching an intense ideological campaign, projecting an image of happy slaves and benevolent masters, arguing that their way of life was beneficial to both races.
There were some pro-slavery writers who argued that what slavery really was the possibility of perfecting the human condition. It's like Americans have been given this gift of Africans. These were people who came to see slavery as something not just good, but natural, permanent, possibly the way you create the ideal community, the ideal world.
Scientists even tried to prove that black people were part of a different species, a species suited for slavery by nature.
They would actually start measuring the size of black people's skulls, and they would talk about how they were not as intelligent because of the shapes of their heads, the size of their brains, and then they would look at things like how robust they were in terms of their, not their brains, but their bodies. And they'd say, well, look at their physical bodies. This is what they're made for, this kind of work.
Even in the North, these racist attitudes held sway. Newspapers brimmed with grotesque caricatures of free black people. Laws were written to restrict their rights, and racial violence became commonplace.
There are a lot of white people in the North who are just plain racist and don't want black people around. And so black people find that they're restricted to certain jobs and certain industries. They find they're restricted to certain places within a city. They find they're only allowed to bury their dead, right, in burial grounds for black people.
Free blacks, North or South, were this kind of an American caste, set apart. They lived insecure lives, threatened lives, and we know this because of certain mobs, riots. A black orphanage in New York City was burned. Black schools were sometimes attacked. They were always weak in cohesion, weak in wealth, weak in power, but nevertheless, they were survivors, and they had leaders.
Despite all they had endured, free black people refused to be intimidated. They had been in America too long and invested too much to back down. In their families, churches, and jobs, they showed that they were fully capable American citizens. And they understood that as long as slavery continued to exist, no black person could be truly free. So they began to agitate for abolition with increasing force. They allied themselves with a few sympathetic whites in the North in order to raise a chorus of voices against the slaveholding South. Perhaps the most powerful voice came from a young man who simply told his own story. Frederick Douglass was raised by his grandmother, Betsy Bailey, in a cabin near these Maryland woods. For the first 6 years of his life, Betsy was the only family he really knew. But then, one morning, Betsy led him away from their home. She had been told to deliver him to work on a plantation 12 miles away. Douglass had no idea what was happening, but Betsy did. She had brought him here for one reason, and one reason only, this boy that she had raised and loved. And that was to abandon him. When they reached this house, Betsy told him to go play with some other children. Then she slipped away. He never saw her again.
The way he remembers it in the autobiographies is as a childhood trauma, laying on the ground crying. And for a 6-year-old, it was as though his world had ended.
Douglass would spend the next 14 years in slavery. Yet he refused to be broken. He kept trying to escape. And on his third try, he succeeded.
He takes a train. He takes actually 2 trains, 3 ferry boats, goes through Philadelphia, crosses the Susquehanna, the Hudson. So it was highly planned, down to the moment he would jump on the train.
Douglass ended up here, in the whaling town of New Bedford, Massachusetts, home to a small, free black community, and central to the burgeoning abolitionist movement.
This is the place where he discovered himself in many ways.
How do you mean?
Well, he was, like many others, simply an escaped slave. And he discovered a voice and a role to be an anti-slavery agitator, to be a revolutionary, if you will. The first speeches he made was in the church.
Douglass found work on these docks, joined a black church in the town, and began to speak out against slavery. Soon, he caught the attention of white abolitionists who desperately needed black voices.
White abolitionists could be militant and committed, but in their voices, the slave experience would be abstract. Whereas with Douglass, he was a manifestation of the principal charges that the abolitionists were making against the slave regime, especially its destruction of the family life of slaves. He could speak directly to that in terms of his own family.
In the summer of 1841, Douglass came here to Nantucket, Massachusetts, to speak at an anti-slavery convention. In the audience sat William Lloyd Garrison, the leading white abolitionist of the day. Douglass was just 23 years old, but he was about to alter history.
It was his first speech before an integrated audience, so he was very nervous. Douglass finishes his speech. Garrison leaps up and says to the audience, you know, do we have here a chattel or do we have a man? And the audience responds, a man. And should this man be returned to slavery? And the audience roared, no.
Frederick Douglass was launched.
Yes. He was invited to join the Anti-Slavery Society as a lecturer.
They hired him on the spot.
Yeah, hired him on the spot. Right.
Douglass began to travel the North giving speeches, living proof of our nation's fundamental hypocrisy, showing audiences that a black person was every bit the equal of a white person.
Frederick Douglass gave us a critique of the United States that's unique and as powerful as any we've ever had. He's speaking to history, to the nation, to the world, about the meaning of the United States and how it has betrayed its promise. There's no better voice of that story and that pain and that promise than Douglass. I mean, he's the Martin Luther King and then some of the 19th century.
Douglass and his allies in the North forced slavery into national politics, making it an issue of intense debate. In the South, slaves pressed the issue themselves by running away whenever and however they could. Their stories filled a growing abolitionist press, giving rise to rumors of a vast network for escapees, soon called the Underground Railroad. Part folklore, part propaganda, the Underground Railroad was never as large as we often imagine, but it was real. A loosely organized network of safe houses in the border states helped more than 20,000 runaways make their way to freedom. The network was run by free blacks and sympathetic whites, and it required immense courage from them all. This is one of the few documented safe houses on the Underground Railroad, and the site of at least one remarkable escape.
Mary Corbett heard a knock on the door, and it was an enslaved man who was fleeing, and the sheriff was after him. And he pleaded to her to help him. So she brings him into the house, and they go all the way up to the attic area, and she points to a very, very, very small little door in the eaves and suggests that he try to crawl in there and hide himself. There's a pounding on the door. The sheriff and his posse are with him, and she opens the door and lets them in. And she tells them they're welcome to search any room in the house. Stop, turn around, and here's the cupboard that Sam hid in.
That?
Yes, Mary Corbett brought him up here, and he squeezed himself in there.
My God, it's just so tiny.
And the sheriff decided not to look because they didn't think that a man could fit in there.
They would have just caught me. I'm too claustrophobic to go in there. I just said, look, let's make a deal.
But if the sheriff is after you with his dogs and guns, he might find a way.
That's incredible. No wonder they didn't look there.
Right.
Amazing.
Infuriated by all the runaways, Southerners pushed for harsh laws to staunch the flow, culminating in the notorious Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, a watershed moment in American history. The law required Northerners to help capture anyone even accused of being a runaway slave, turning the North into a police power for the South. It also placed every free black person in terrible danger.
Every time you walked on the street, you were subject to being claimed as a slave. That you're living every day afraid and watching over your shoulder to make sure that you're not being watched by someone who was looking for you or someone else, and will happily take you if they can't find someone else.
As bounty hunters flooded northern cities, black people began to look for freedom in ever more distant places. Small numbers have been running away to Canada since the Revolutionary War. Now, they began to come here, to Niagara Falls on the Canadian border, in droves.
Why Canada? No slavery. And no slavery meant no slave catchers. In Canada, a black person could serve on a jury.
a black person could vote. A black person could own property. A black person could become a citizen. Canada was for black people what the United States was for white people. The land of the free, the home of the brave. Over 10,000 African Americans fled to Canada in the 1850s, including the most well-known conductor of the Underground Railroad, Harriet Tubman. Tubman settled here in the tiny town of St. Catharines and joined this church, which became a hub for runaways. There are black families still living in this town who trace their roots back to those runaways. People whose ancestors took an almost unimaginable risk.
Here is just one portion of the descendant wall from 1838 all the way to today. So this is portions of the Cassile family. You had to get out of the South, and you were on your own. What did you have? You didn't have a map, you didn't have the education, you had nothing. So you had to be able to rely on the North Star and yourself. I want to point out my immediate family. So this is on my mother's side.
This is the home team.
Yeah, this is my mom's mom. And then bounty hunters are after you. So there was a lot at risk, and not many would do it. And those that did, I mean, it's documented. You had to be a little bit bent.
You had to be, you had to be totally crazy.
Yeah. When I was a youngster, we knew of the stories, but I never appreciated any of it, never looked back or even thought about it until I was grown. And then it's like, my God, my people did that?
Mm-hmm.
That's how we got here?
The very existence of these families, an entire community of people descended from escaped slaves, is a testament to their strength.
When I think about the Underground Railroad, it makes me want to claim slaves, right, as my ancestors, because they were genius in order to pull something off like this. I think about this and I think, wow, you know, slavery is not a shame on me, because my ancestors were some of the most creative, resourceful people in the history of the United States. That's a shame on the slaveholders, but there's no stigma that I bear by being descended from people who could do something like that, you know, who could pull something like that off.
Unfortunately, the Underground Railroad was out of reach for almost all slaves. Only a fraction ever made it to freedom. Their stories are inspiring, but their experience was not typical. As the Civil War drew near, almost 4 million slaves remained trapped in a nation still struggling to resolve its most fundamental contradictions. Their lives were desperate, and the choices they faced are hard to contemplate. Covington, Kentucky, the northern border of the slaveholding South. In January of 1856, an enslaved woman named Margaret Garner lived here on a farm. Margaret was 22, she was married with 4 children. Freedom lay just 5 miles away, so she and her husband decided to run. They traveled by night and made it here to the banks of the Ohio River at dawn. This was the barrier between slave Kentucky and free Ohio. It was a 1/4 mile wide and frozen solid.
They got here just before sunrise.
So they must have been exhausted and terrified.
And cold.
And cold, yeah. And they look over there, and there's nothing but ice.
Frozen solid.
A natural footbridge.
A natural footbridge to freedom.
The Garners walked across the river, risking their lives with every step. And then they arrived at a small house in Ohio, owned by a free black man. But their triumph was short-lived. Within hours, federal marshals had tracked the family down.
They got a big block of wood and start ramming in the door. They try to go into the windows, and outside a crowd is gathering, just to see this scene taking place. Inside there's mayhem, there's alarm, people are hysterical at the thought that they were so close to freedom and had only enjoyed it for 2 hours. And now, it looks like they're going to be returned into bondage.
Nightmare.
Yes.
Barricaded in the house, Margaret Garner did something unthinkable.
As the marshals were battering in the house, Margaret Garner decided, rather than return to slavery, she would kill her children.
When the marshals finally broke in, they were confronted by a horrible scene. Margaret had slashed the throat of her daughter Mary. Mary lay on the floor, dead. Hiding in the next room were her 2 young sons, still alive, but bruised and bleeding. Margaret, knife in hand, was quite clear about what she'd done and why.
The only direct quote we have from Margaret Garner about the murder was, she says, "I did the best that a mother could do, and I would have done better and more for the rest. I've done the best I could."
Meaning I would have killed them all.
Right.
If I could have.
And for her, she said this to a couple of visitors who saw her when she was in jail, that this was freedom. She called her deceased toddler a bird for having flown into freedom.
Margaret Garner quickly became a legend, celebrated and condemned across the country. What she had done became fodder for both sides of the slavery debate. Southern whites claimed that Margaret showed that black people were subhuman, capable of monstrous deeds, and in need of their master's paternal care. Abolitionists claimed that Margaret revealed the essential inhumanity of bondage.
Margaret Garner stood for powerful ideas, images on all sides, and perhaps not enough for her own side. Just like, I'm not a poster child for abolitionism, and I'm not a defective mother, but I am a woman who knows what it feels like, looks like, means to be a slave, and I don't want that for my children.
Margaret Garner's story had a final tragic turn. An Ohio court ruled that, as a slave, she was property and couldn't be tried for murder. So she was given back to her owner. And here, on a riverboat heading south, Margaret made one last decision about her family. She let her infant daughter Celia slip into the icy water and drown.
If Celia had only lived 9 more years, she would have been free. But Margaret couldn't have possibly known that. Margaret preferred to kill her own children rather than to allow them to live the social death of slavery.
It was a horrifying decision, but it tells us something about the America of its time. Slavery was so deeply embedded in the nation that violence seemed the only way to end it. And much more violence was coming.
Funding for the African Americans, Many Rivers to Cross was made possible by
Senegal, Africa. the door of no return. From these shores, millions of Africans went across oceans and continents, battlefields, racial barriers, and constitutional divides. Bank of America is proud to sponsor Many Rivers to Cross, an epic journey through 500 years of African American history. We believe connecting to our past helps us all create a better future.
Yeah, they have it. Wi-Fi, settings.
May I, Mr. Jones?
Please.
Some connections are generational.
Thanks.
Others, just a few minutes. Either way, our signal is strong and deeply rooted in the community. The simple joy of staying in touch.
The Howard and Abby Milstein Foundation, in partnership with Hoover Milstein and Emigrant Bank.
African American history is an epic story, our American story. We're proud to fund this important program. Please join us in supporting your public television station.
The Coca-Cola Company. The Ford Foundation Just Films. Dr. Georgette Bennett and Dr. Leonard Polanski, in memory of Rabbi Mark H. Tannenbaum. Richard Gilder. The Hutchins Family Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by viewers like you, thank you. Next time on The African Americans, the country erupts in civil war.
Lincoln would have seen black refugees camped out all over the city.
But what would freedom bring?
What's happening during Reconstruction is black people become a threat to white supremacy.
The African Americans, Many Rivers to Cross. The African American story continues online at pbs.org/manyrivers with streaming video and more.
With the outbreak of the Civil War in 1861, African Americans, like the country itself, were plunged into chaos. Their freedom at stake, they risked everything for victory. 5 years later, slavery was over. But what would freedom really mean? Reconstruction brought another period of roiling uncertainty. But never did African Americans relinquish their quest for the real prize, freedom and the rights of citizenship. The lengths they would go and the price they would pay make this one of the most inspiring stories in American history.
Funding for the African Americans, Many Rivers to Cross was made possible by
Senegal, Africa, the door of no return. From these shores, millions of Africans went across oceans and continents, battlefields, racial barriers, and constitutional divides. Bank of America is proud to sponsor Many Rivers to Cross, an epic journey through 500 years of African American history. We believe connecting to our past helps us all create a better future.
Yeah, they have it. Wi-Fi, settings.
May I, Mr. Jones?
Please.
Some connections are generational.
Thanks.
Others, just a few minutes. Either way, our signal is strong and deeply rooted in the community. The simple joy of staying in touch.
The Howard and Abby Milstein Foundation, in partnership with Hoover Milstein and Emigrant Bank.
African American history is an epic story, our American story. We're proud to fund this important program. Please join us in supporting your public television station.
The Coca-Cola Company. The Ford Foundation Just Films. Dr. Georgette Bennett and Dr. Leonard Polanski, in memory of Rabbi Mark H. Tannenbaum. Richard Gilder. The Hutchins Family Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities. The W.K. Kellogg Foundation, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. And by viewers like you, thank you.
In the early morning of April 12, 1861, Southern cannons opened fire on Fort Sumter, a federal garrison in Charleston Harbor. The North and South were at war. When the Civil War began, more than 3.9 million slaves faced a terrible choice: to be forced to aid a Confederate army they despised, or gamble everything on escape. 500,000 chose to break and run. Not only would they change the tide of war, they would change its meaning, turning a war about Union into a war about slavery. One of my favorite stories of the Civil War happened right here at the Battery, just a year after the outbreak of the war over at Fort Sumter. As Charleston slept, a young black man, a slave, plotted his escape aboard a ship. Robert Smalls was a 23-year-old slave pressed into service for the Confederacy aboard a warship called the Planter. For nearly a year, he quietly observed the movements of the ship and its crew. Just before dawn on May 13, 1862, Smalls took his chance. While the ship's officers slept ashore, he and his fellow slave crewmen pulled anchor and eased the Planter into Charleston Harbor.
They had prearranged to meet their family members and to pick them up, and then come back down the peninsula, and they begin the process, and this is in the wee hours of the morning, of sailing out of the harbor. They are embarked now on an extremely dangerous journey.
Smalls knew these waters like the back of his hand, but he also knew the risks that lay ahead. 4 Confederate checkpoints: Castle Pinckney, Fort Ripley, Fort Johnson, and Fort Sumter. Isn't Smalls afraid of being caught? How in the world is a black slave going to pull this off?
He's extremely afraid of being caught. He disguises himself as the captain and also mimics the captain's gait as he walked back and forth across the wheelhouse.
Smalls slipped past the first 3 checkpoints undetected. The most dangerous checkpoint remained: Fort Sumter, with its mighty guns and fearsome cannons. Discovery would mean certain death. As dawn broke, the crew urged Smalls to take a wide berth, but changing course could arouse suspicion. Smalls gave the signal. A few seconds later, the counter signal came back. Pass on by. So they're safe, right? They're free?
Well, they're not completely free, because now we have the situation where a Confederate flagged vessel is sailing out and it begins to approach the vessels of the Union Naval Blockading Force.
Fortunately, the vessel was not fired on. As astonished Union officers boarded the Planter, Smalls stood at attention, saluted, and spoke.
I am delivering this war material, including these cannons, and I think Uncle Abraham Lincoln can put them to good use.
Smalls was ready.
That's
ready
right.
With his line for history. I like
That's
that.
right. That's right.
I don't know exactly what you are now, the officer told Smalls, but you're certainly no longer slaves. Robert Smalls' escape personified a new, more determined attitude among Southern slaves. Before the war, his bold act would have been in vain. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 decreed that runaway slaves were to be hunted down and returned to their masters in chains. But all that changed on May 23, 1861, less than a year before Small's escape, when 3 runaway slaves made it here to Fort Monroe, a Union-held outpost in Confederate Virginia. The slaves were taken before Union Major General Benjamin Butler. Defying the law, Butler refused to return the fugitive slaves to the Confederacy. Instead, he invented a new status for them. They were contraband of war, illegal property now forfeited to the North. Butler could have no idea how wide a door he had opened.
The Contraband Act doesn't legally free them, but if you're a slave on the ground and you're reach Union lines, that act says that the officer is required to retain you, put you to work. In practice, you're free.
The word went out through the slaves' grapevine, and all these Negroes descend upon Fort Monroe. I bet the Army didn't know what hit them.
No, they didn't, and they didn't know what to do. Hundreds came over here, and they were located in and around the fort. So there were all these makeshift camps everywhere. Dysentery was very common, tuberculosis, all kinds of diseases. It was a horrendous situation.
Neither slave nor free, the contraband had found sanctuary, but were little more than refugees, a burden to the war effort in the eyes of some Northern soldiers.
We can't imagine, I don't think, the cost, the courage, the difficulty of making that journey and getting there. And some commanders saying, okay, we have to take them in, but don't give them food because that will make them lazy.
Still, the escaped slaves kept coming in a great upsurge of hope and courage. Although their status remained as uncertain as the war itself, the contraband sought to live as fully free men and women. Even in the midst of squalid camps, they pursued a privilege long denied to slaves, learning to read and write. Some contraband began their education here, on what is today the campus of Hampton University, one of the country's oldest black colleges. It was all made possible by a visionary teacher named Mary Peak. For Peak, an educated woman of color, liberating the mind was as important as freeing the body. Before the war, she had taught slaves in secret, defying the law. But in Union-occupied Hampton, Virginia, those laws no longer applied. Peak conducted her lessons beneath the branches of this oak tree, which incredibly still stands today.
No one even knew at the beginning of the war if a Union victory would even lead to the abolition of slavery.
No.
So why would she do it?
I think that, like a lot of blacks, she saw this as an opportunity.
She was passionate about using her skills, her talents and abilities to help uplift the community.
Mary Peak's contraband students let nothing keep them from learning.
There was a mother and a daughter. They were living in this tent. They had one dress between the two of them. And so during the day, the daughter would wear the dress and go to school and then come back after school, and the mother would then do some work and then go to night school. So they shared a single dress between the two of them.
How quickly does her school grow?
It starts with a handful, but then quickly they're 50, then they're 100. She ended up with 900 students.
900 students.
What she was trying to do was to prepare people to really be full citizens.
Escaped slaves were changing their own lives, but they were also transforming the fate of the nation. By the summer of 1862, President Lincoln faced a dilemma. Not only was the North losing the war, but runaway slaves were forcing him finally to confront the question of slavery itself. Lincoln's first objective in the war had been to save the Union. "I have no purpose," he had proclaimed, "to interfere with the institution of slavery." But now, military necessity converged with the moral imperative of ending slavery. This was the country in 1862.
It was. And therefore, for Lincoln, a place he could escape to. He came here pretty often in the summer of '62, which is this critical summer where he was writing the proclamation.
This is Camp David.
This is his Camp David.
As he wrote and made the journey to this cottage, he would have seen Black refugees camped out all over the city. What do you do with them? You just keep ignoring them? Enslaved people were making the war their war. They were making the war about freedom and emancipation.
African Americans are arguing the easiest way to win the war is to emancipate slaves. And they make a brilliant point that eventually the Lincoln administration accepts that you need us. If you want to win this war, you need us.
Lincoln knew he could no longer avoid committing himself and the nation to slavery's eradication. On September 22nd, Lincoln showed his cabinet the outlines of a bold plan. Emancipate the slaves in enemy territory and encourage them to find safety behind Union lines. On January 1st, 1863, he issued the final draft to the nation. From that day on, it read, "Any slave within a rebellious state shall be thenceforward, and forever free." Though the proclamation didn't abolish slavery, nor declare all slaves free, it was a powerful statement, redefining the war's purpose as ending slavery. For African Americans, enslaved or free, the Emancipation Proclamation was their Declaration of Independence.
When you read the words in the Emancipation Proclamation that say, "thenceforward and forever free," you don't read or hear the words, the exceptions, the limitations that follow. You hear that you're free. And that was all that was needed. That snowball was on that steep cliff. It just got kicked off and there was no stopping it.
The proclamation encouraged slaves to abandon their plantations, but it couldn't help them do so. They would have to run that risk themselves in a gamble for freedom.
The Union military is constantly on the move. You've got to make a decision knowing that you will have to navigate enemy territory. The amazing thing is that these 500,000 people, they took that chance, they left.
They left.
Everything that they knew on the hope that they were part of this age of emancipation and age of freedom.
The proclamation held one more surprise. It granted Black men the right to fight for the Union.
Imagine knowing that they could now actually take up legally arms in their own defense.
Revolutionary.
Revolutionary. That has to be the most important thing about the Emancipation Proclamation.
Without a doubt.
Without a doubt.
A white man could be legally killed by a Black man.
A slaveholder could be legally killed by his former slave.
That's heavy.
That's everything.
Nearly 200,000 African Americans enlisted in the military during the war, including my great-granduncle. They fought for themselves, they fought for each other, and they fought for those who had been left behind. But most of all, they fought for a future with hope, a future of freedom and equal rights. Their stories are honored here at the African American Civil War Memorial and Museum in Washington, D.C. Harry, given the fact that the military today is so black, my students find it extraordinarily difficult to believe that black men had to fight for the right to fight, as it were. Why?
It's like the 1940s and 50s and the arguments that African Americans, the Negro, cannot play basketball because it requires too much of the intellect. Well, that's the argument during the Civil War. They're not intelligent enough. They don't have the agility, the courage, the determination to be a good soldier.
While the Emancipation Proclamation gave African American men the right to fight, it did nothing to guarantee their equal treatment. Northern white soldiers were skeptical of black soldiers. Southern soldiers simply reviled them. Confederate President Jefferson Davis made it clear: all black Union soldiers would be treated as slaves in rebellion.
Jeff Davis would come out with a proclamation stating that if a colored soldier is captured, he will be returned to his owner. If the owner could not be found, the state would take the responsibility and they would be put to hard labor. But the Confederate soldiers would behave not according to protocol in many cases.
Perhaps the Confederate Army's worst atrocities against African American troops came at the Battle of Fort Pillow, Tennessee, in 1864. As defeat loomed, African American soldiers attempted to surrender. Confederate troops massacred them.
255 African American soldiers were given no quarters. No quarters means that when you're captured as a prisoner of war, they do not take you through the regular protocol.
What you're saying is they wouldn't allow black soldiers to surrender. They just killed them.
You do not allow them the honor of being a soldier.
255 black soldiers were killed in cold blood. It was the Confederacy's brutal reminder to African Americans of the price they would pay for rising up against slavery. Only 6 months later, black soldiers would have their revenge. It was September 29th, 1864. Union troops assembled in New Market Heights, a small town right outside of Richmond, the capital of the Confederacy. They were led by Benjamin Butler, the same Benjamin Butler who early in the war had refused to return fugitive slaves to the South. At New Market Heights, he commanded black troops to lead the assault.
Butler, before the assault, he rides around through the troops and tells them, you go in crying, remember Fort Pillow. They're up against veteran Texas troops, and to take New Market Heights, capture the closest position to Richmond. You want to send troops who have the determination that won't back down. They're under strict orders not to stop to fire. And your comrades are falling consistently as they're moving forward. In the 4th and 6th United States Colored Troops, they get almost wiped out. That's the next wave. But it's not easy for the next wave either. Don't stop. They just keep coming. Confederates are hearing us to remember Fort Pillow and withdraw from the position. I've read some scholars who would say they just decided they'd defend another position. That's always interesting to me.
The position is called cover from ass.
That's why the performance of United States troops in these battles so important because they don't stop. They don't just say, we captured Market Heights and we're partying, the game's over. They continue. It's only a matter of time before Richmond falls.
So that's it. The cake's all dough, as my daddy would say.
By April, the war was over, and with it, the promise of the end of nearly 3.5 centuries of American slavery. The human cost was unprecedented. Nearly 750,000 lives lost. 40,000 of them African Americans. More deaths than all other American wars combined. The country entered the period known as Reconstruction, the massive federal effort to rebuild a new South. The future of the former slaves was anything but clear. Their chins had been struck. Would they realize their hope for new lives as free and equal citizens? We're heading to Edisto Island, which is the home of famous sea island cotton, finest cotton in the world. Legend has it, even Pope wear his garments made out of sea island cotton. This was a place where black people actually had a chance to take their part in the promise of America. And the promise of America will always land the right to own property. Who understood that better than people who served as property themselves? Man, it must have been like to farm this island, producing this rich sea cotton for all those years, backbreaking labor, and then have the opportunity to farm that land for yourself. It must have been one of the most exciting moments in the history of the African American people. All of the South, he promised some land of your own, filled African Americans with optimism. As the federal government set about constructing, African Americans waited eagerly to receive their own lots. Their optimism was born in part from a remarkable pledge made for slaves just a few months before war's end. Today, the phrase 40 acres and a mule has an ironic connotation. For newly freed slaves, it represented a tangible manifestation of their new stake in America. In fact, the idea came from the black community itself. January 1865, 20 black ministers were summoned in Savannah with Major General Wood Tecumseh Sherman and Secretary of War Edwin M. Stanton. The general and the secretary wanted some advice. What did former slaves most desire when the war ended? Harrison Fraser, the 67-year-old minister chosen to lead the group, responded equivocally. The best way we can take care of ourselves, Fraser told them, is to have land and turn and till it by our own labor. We want to be placed on land until we are able to buy it and make it our own. I would prefer to live by ourselves, for there's a prejudice against us in the South that will take years to get over. Give the former slaves land and let them be self-governing. That's the birth of 40 Acres in a Mule. 4 days later, Sherman issued Special Field Order 50. Some 400,000 acres of confiscated land would be doled out in 40-acre tracts to the heads of former slave families. As bonus, Sherman twins broken down mules left over from the war. Here on Esto Island, black women and men who had once worked this land as slaves could now claim their own 40 acres as free people. So Bernard, set the scene for me. They come back with all that expectation. They're going to land for the first time. They get their 40 acres.
This would have been a very difficult time for them. They were more free than they had ever been before. But now they'd be faced with the prospect of trying to recraft and reconstruct their lives. And it wasn't absolutely certain what the parameters of their freedoms were going to be like. Would have subsisted off of army ration. But nevertheless, I think, with all of this deprivation that they were surrounded by, there was the hope of a new day.
Well, look at the wallpaper.
That's right.
Newspapers and magazines.
Right. That's right. They were only given what we call promissory titles, not permanent titles, but they expected to receive clear and title to the land down the road.
But the former slaves never did get their titles. Less than a year later, Lincoln was dead. His successor, Andrew Johnson, began to dismantle the plan for Reconstruction. Started with 40 acres in a mule. Confiscated lands were returned to their former owners. For African Americans, President Johnson's order was a crushing disappointment. Still, they had no choice but to keep going, placing their hopes in a reconstructed South. It's something I wonder about and think, geez, how could you survive every day and have hope, build a family, fall in love?
That's right. And I guess that's all you have is hope, right? Hope did bring people through, and it gave them a firm foundation upon which to visualize their future.
If hope is the foundation of the former slaves' new lives, love and family would be its and mortar.
Thousands of people have lost their kin, and thousands of people are very keen to find family members and friends who are sold away.
In freedom, they set out to rebuild families shattered by slavery. They filled newspapers with information wanted ads and long-lost family members.
The ads capture the loss that slavery brought in terms of having your child torn from your arms. There would not be as many reunions as there had been separations, but it didn't stop people from yearning and trying to imagine what that baby of 4 months old looked like 20 years since. How had your child fared?
Freedom promised a future where black women and men would have control over their most fundamental decisions. They get married, they get new names, and worshiped free in their own churches. For the first time, African American women and men could define the terms of their family labor.
A black mother could say, I will not stay overnight anymore, and my 10-year-old daughter who comes to work with me every day will now be going to school for 3 months. And when she is not in school, coming here with me, it meant reclaiming your right as a human being.
The social changes former slaves experienced were not matched by economic progress. One aspect of the society remained fixed. Old King Cotton still. Without land of their own, many freed slaves went back on cotton plantations, some for their former masters, who did their utmost to impose poor wages and work conditions. But once in a great while, freed slaves seized a chance for something more. One man was Benjamin Montgomery, who had been the favorite slave to David Benton Plantation, the crown jewel of Mississippi's planter aristocracy.
Benjamin Montgomery purchased it from his former slave, Joseph Davis. Joseph Davis, the brother of the president of the Confederacy.
When Union forces closed in, Joseph Davis had fled the plantation. After the war ended, the early Davis made a bold and surprising choice. He gave his former slave a loan to buy the property that he and his brother Jefferson once shared. These columns are all the main of the house that Jeff built. Standing here, I try to picture what it was like at Davis's heyday. A rambling eight-room home with a front and back porch from which dozens of slaves could be seen tilling the soil. Now, one of them, Benjamin Montgomery, owned a home built by the President of the Confederacy. And soon, he began to recruit his fellow former slaves to join him at Davis Bank.
We would rent out the land to them, and together they would build a successful crop that would ultimately bring benefits to all of them.
And profit they did.
In 1870, Montgomery was the third largest cotton planter in the state of Mississippi.
That's a lot.
And Mississippi is the largest producer in the country. That makes him the third largest planter in the country at that time. It was not just the quantity of cotton, it was the quality of it. He was winning awards left and right. And he was widely regarded and widely respected by fellow Mississippi planters. Most of them are white.
If this were a Spike Lee film, the Ku Klux Klan would have come down that hill through the river valley, roasted Benjamin Montgomery and his new plantation.
Right.
But that didn't happen. Why not?
Local white Southerners and white planters in particular were willing to allow him to carry on with his economic activity as long as he stayed out of the limelight. At least that was his perception. He's doing a lot of work culturally and socially to kind of keep people happy with him, white people in particular.
Montgomery was playing a delicate, dangerous game, appeasing whites so he could continue to profit from land. It was a gamble, but it was paying off. Ultimately, African Americans knew if they're going to protect the extent that they had gained in the South, they couldn't depend on the largesse of whites. They needed political power of their own. To get it, they need the right vote.
African Americans are very, very sensitive and great. In a sense, historians, they understood that this social revolution should be a revolution about equality under the law for all people. If you're African American, you have the vote, you have a voice, you have a public voice that whites had long sought to suppress.
Their struggle for the vote took place in a large political context. Northern Republicans feared that the free African American population might play into the hands of their enemies, the Southern Democrats.
The Three-Fifths Clause, which was the formula used for determining how many congressmen any state was entitled to, that was over with now. And so rather than 3/5 of the slaves being counted, now it was the total free population. And so that really was a political boon to the South, and it would have been used against the North.
But if African Americans were given the vote, it created alliances with the Republicans to forge an unstoppable political force. Republican-controlled Congress grabbed the chance, passing the 14th Amendment, granting full citizenship and equal protection under the law to anyone born in the United States, regardless of race. And in the 15th Amendment, they gave black men the right to vote.
For the first time, blacks in many communities did have equal representation. You had black legislators in Mississippi, in Alabama, and in South Carolina.
Even South Carolina, the state that fired the first in the Civil War, saw black men, former slaves, elected to office. One of them was Robert Smalls, the same man who narrowly escaped from slavery on a boat in Charleston Harbor. In 1868, Smalls was elected by the voters of Beaufort County to the South Carolina House of Representatives. All told, 6,000 African Americans would hold office between 1868 and 1876. Were sheriffs, justices of the peace, even mayors. The first African Americans would be elected to the United States Senate and the House of Representatives. These politicians promised to use the Reconstruction period to transform the South, politically, economically, and socially.
This would have demonstrated, I think, the virtually unlimited possibilities of the future.
But the transfer of political power in the South triggered a violent backlash of whites who saw their world-life threat. The small window of opportunity for free blacks was slammed shut as all levels of white society reacted. Utah, Alabama, Democrats assault rally black and white Republicans. 4 black men murdered. Colfax, Louisiana. 300 armed white men attack African Americans over contested outcome of the local election. 100 men massacred.
What's happening during Reconstruction is the possibilities, right, of racial equality are emerging. Black people become a threat to, white supremacy.
Most Southern whites could not envision a society in which blacks had rights, in which blacks were treated as humans. They just assumed that black supremacy would replace white supremacy. It would be one or the other. And that fueled their desire to do anything possible to prevent that from happening.
It would particularly pursue people who had achieved what they saw as unreasonable success. The image of a man with his own wagon or carriage on the street. This became a rallying cry for white supremacy.
Identify the leading African American and you just murder them. Ideally, do so in public to send a message and a warning. Know your place.
As the violence escalated, Northern Republicans began to reassess their support for Southern blacks. Political alliances were one thing, a second civil war was another. There's a feeling in this country, one African-American observer wrote, that the Negro has cut out as much as ought to have. The final betrayal came in 1876. With the presidential election deadlocked and both political parties claiming victory, Republican Rutherford B. Hayes cut a cynical backroom deal with Southern Democrats. In return for the presidency, Hayes promised to remove the final 1,000 federal troops lingering in the South. For African Americans, the meaning of that symbolic gesture was all too clear. Reconstruction is over.
By 1876, let's face it, most conservative and moderate whites had lost whatever sympathy they had for African Americans. And they rationalized by saying, well, look what we've already done for them. We've passed the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment. We've given them everything they need. It's time they figure it out on their own.
So 250 years of slavery, 10 years of freedom.
Yes.
You're on your own.
Southern Democrats take back the South from the Republican Party and from all of these black people who have occupied positions in Southern legislatures. So you have the establishment of white supremacy, brick by brick in these Southern territories.
Once again, African Americans in the South could only depend on their own tenacity and hope. Isaiah Montgomery, to his father Benjamin, run a successful cotton empire and his matched former plantation, David Benn, only to lose the land when the economically volatile years after Reconstruction left family mired in debt. Now, Isaiah was determined to build a haven for black people in a remote corner of Mississippi.
The Delta was majority black, that was largely unsettled. Isaiah Montgomery saw himself as improving upon his father's dream, and he improved upon it by making this a paradise for black landowners.
Isaiah would call a new town Mount Bayou. It was a self-contained, all-black borough.
The idea of having your own grocery stores, your own sidewalks to walk down, free from the kind of constant harassment and the constant threat of violence that pervaded most southern towns by this point, is simply unimaginable.
Mount Bayou residents today remember all kind of respect their relatives were afforded, especially by Southerners.
They'll remember my granddad. He went to the local track shop there in Cleveland, Mississippi, and he stood in the back. There was this young guy that had not long been working behind the counter, and he saw my granddad, and he said, "Nigger, take your hat off." And so my granddad just stood there, and folks said the next time, he said, and then they say, "Come here." And they say, "That's not a nigger. He's from Mount Bayou."
I believe that only by living apart from white people could black Southerners thrive. Fallback Town also appeased white Southerners, increasingly determined to impose racial segregation on the South.
Well, white America did not fear Mount Montgomery already made clear in various ways that he had no intentions of being a political problem. That is, he had no intention of claiming his rights beyond the confines of building his business and his world in Bayou.
In 1890, Isaiah was the only black delegate to the Mississippi State Constitutional Convention. Hoping to protect the Bayou from violence, he reluctantly voted in favor of literacy tests, knowing that they would effectively bar black men from voting in Mississippi. It was a bargain that would reverberate across the South for decades to come.
He said, I'm willing to sacrifice 123,000 men in order that white people will give us some breathing room. We will stand back and let you have the political arena. We will let you have the franchise. Just a little bit of room so that we can, do a few things.
Isaiah himself acknowledged that it was a compromise. But you have to understand the South, and particularly Mississippi at the time, there is a lynching in the South it's either third day or fourth day. He needs everything he can to ensure that the whites aren't going to get outraged and have a reason for torching and burning his community. And one reason is to say, okay, I'll accept your disfranchisement. I just want to retain my autonomous black community.
So, was it possible? Was there a scenario that you imagined where their logic made sense?
In the United States of America, which was a democracy, the notion that you would have to give your freedom to become free just doesn't make sense. That you can bargain away the future freedoms of people by giving, up rights. I think it was like the devil's path. Do it and hope that, okay, we accommodate them better, but and they did not.
The Southern legislatures mounted a relentless assault on their hard-won rights. African Americans devised new strategies to hold on to the gains they had made during Reconstruction. On June 7, 1892, Homer Plessy strode through the streets of his native New Orleans to the train station. This was no idle stroll. He was about to test the 4th Amendment's promise of equal protection under law. He would board a white passenger car and refuse to move to the black one.
Keith, June of 1892, Pratt Street Depot. What is Plessy doing there?
Homer Plessy is attempting to be arrested, booked, and tried for violating the segregation laws of 1890. Well, I think he was very confident that he wouldn't be hung that day because there's a secret plan in effect to actually orchestrate his arrest.
Conceived by a group of black Republicans, Plessy's gambit was a calculated act of civil disobedience, breaking Louisiana law in the hope of landing the case in the United States Supreme Court. The group had chosen Homer Plessy for one overriding reason. He was so like-complectioned that he was indistinguishable from whites.
Why didn't the guy in Brighton white?
What they wanted to do is to tell courts that, you're putting someone on there whose race has to be determined by a train conductor. How can this be the basis of law when every train conductor has to look carefully, right? People and look at think this person is a Negro with skin. Yeah, exactly. Like as if it would have a Negro meter or something like that. It's patently absurd. Plessis seeks his ticket. He goes right to the colored car, sits in the white car, and that's when a plainclothes officer warns him to get off the train, and when he doesn't move, arrests him and takes him.
The case did make it all the way to the Supreme Court, but the justices didn't do what Plessy and his backers hoped. In a momentous decision that would shape the next half-century, they upheld Louisiana's segregation law. The Supreme Court decided that separate, be equal, was the law of the land. Justice might be blind, but the United States Constitution would no longer be colorblind. The Plessy decision put the final blow to the brief, flickering hope of Reconstruction. Now, the law relegated African Americans to the margins of society. Free? Yes. Equal?
That drastically reduces horizons for black people. So what they begin to do is they begin to live within the limitations set by the federal government and the state government. It does mean that traditions of struggle end. Throughout darkest days of Jim Crow segregation, the black freedom struggle never go away.
The poet Langston Hughes would compare the extraordinary experience of Reconstruction to telescopic dreams. Through one end, the dream looms larger, so much larger it seems than truth can be. In the telescope around he tells us, and wonder why what was so large becomes so small again. As the 12th century dawned, African-American people could only ask themselves, where has all our freedom gone? Facing the irony of winning the freedom war only to lose their rights under the law, could they summon the strength for a new fight? Could they ever reach the elusive promised land?
Funding for the African American Many Rivers to Cross was made possible by
Senegal, Africa, the door of no return. From these shores, millions of Africans went across ocean and continents, battlefields, racial barriers, and constitutional divide. Bank of America is a proud sponsor of Many Rivers to Cross and journey through 500 years of African American history. We believe connecting with